Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me for the last time as we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe in the 100th episode of the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. Today, we're joined by Dr. Julia Carden, who's the founder of Carden Consulting and a highly respected executive coach, supervisor, and educator. Julia began her career as a Royal Naval Officer, later moving into roles in HR and leadership development, before founding her own consultancy in 2008. Over the years, she's worked with leaders and teams across both the public and private sectors, helping them to grow their confidence, clarity, and capacity. Her coaching practice is grounded in her PhD research on self-awareness, which is really exciting for us. A theme that runs through her work with clients and also through her forthcoming book, You Are Not as Self-Aware as You Think You Are, which will be coming out in October because I checked before coming on screen. Julia's approach is both developmental and systemic, so she supports the whole person while keeping in mind the complex environments in which they operate. In addition to her consultancy, Julia is a visiting tutor at Henley Business School. She's also an accredited coach, helping leaders to reflect deeply, grow meaningfully, and lead with greater self-awareness. Julia, it's the 100th and final episode of the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. So to have another expert whose doctorate focused on self-awareness on the show is just awesome. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. And what a privilege to be on your 100th podcast.
The 100th
Wow.
one. Julia, tell us about your journey from being a naval officer to leadership coaching. How does that journey fit together?
Yeah. Actually, I joined as a RENS officer. I know I hopefully don't look as old as that, but when I joined, girls were very separate to the men. We had blue
Uh,
stripes, not gold, and we were known as Women's Royal Naval Service. So it changed when I was in. But yeah, the journey into this space. So my last formal job in the Navy was to work in the Admiralty Interview Board, where they assess and select potential Royal Naval, Royal Marine officers, medics, dentists, and chaplains. And so got very interested in the assessment centre side of HR. Then went off to HR consultancy, working for some other companies, and really started honing in on this assessment and development centre piece. During that time, did all my psychometric testing qualifications. They're feeding back in a very coaching style. They're encouraging you to feed back in a coaching style. And that's really what led me into that space. So that was the transition. And then from the leadership development, building on all that I had been trained and learnt to do, I really realised early on in my HR career that I was more a learning and development specialist than a what I would call a HR, people resourcing, employee relations type specialist.
Amazing. So when you talk about self-awareness, what exactly do you mean? Because I'm sure listeners and watchers know what I mean. I've talked about it for the last 3 years, but how do you define it?
Yeah, I know you and I had a conversation because I think we were doing our research about the same
Yes.
time and how annoying that we didn't know we were doing the research at the same time. So it's a really complex, dynamic, and ever-evolving construct. I'm going to use the word construct. That's what the academics would call it. So
Yeah.
that's the first thing I want to say. And so I'm very conscious of the fact, however I define it, somehow it minimizes the complexity of what it is. So it's aware of our inner self, what drives us, what defines us. So that'd be things like values and beliefs, our motivations, our needs, our physiological awareness, what's going on in our body at any one time, where there are moments of tension or flutters or movements. So all of that awareness of our inner self and what defines us, combined with how others experience us. So I talk about the intrapersonal within us, and then the interpersonal, how others experience us, those we're leading and manage. I've got a neat little definition I use, but I've also got a pictorial definition, which is on my website, which I feel is much more rich than just a few sentences.
We will make sure that there is a link to that infographic in the show notes so that if anybody wants to go and find out more about it, they certainly can. So, what did your PhD focus on and what were your findings?
So The main research focus is what is the role of self-awareness in the development of the executive coach, which you could replace with the development of an executive senior leader if you wanted to, but I wanted to hone it in on coach development. So the first big finding, so I should say that I did 3 distinct studies, and I did it by publication. So there was a paper associated with each of the studies, but they fed together. The first big finding, which slightly hijacked how deep I wanted to go with the other research, was that it was an ill-defined and undefined construct within the realms of adult development. So that would be leadership development, MBA work, and other leadership development. So it wasn't defined at all. The other big finding was that it's used interchangeably with other terms about self, like self-knowledge and self-consciousness. So that meant that I then spent the first study defining self-awareness within the context of adult development. So I hadn't planned on doing that. So that was the first finding. I then explored what role it plays in the development of executive coaches and leaders. And the finding there was what it gives you is this ability to connect with self, who we are. And through connecting with self, we can then connect better and deeper with others. And from a leadership perspective and from a coaching perspective, I always say you can't connect with others if you haven't first connected with yourself. So if there's parts of yourself that you're not wanting to confront or look into, then that's going to provide an unconscious barrier to those that we're leading and or working with as a coach. So that was my other finding, this deep connection to self through self-awareness. And then in terms of how to develop it, I sort of had this very naive plan when I started my research that I'd come up with some model of how to develop self-awareness, and then it'd go tick and I'd be able to commercialize it and commoditize it and sell it. I mean, how ridiculously naive I was. So there is no one way of developing it. And actually, it needs multiple, I've referred to it like a jigsaw puzzle. We need multiple pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. And we need to be moving those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle around. Maybe sometimes a piece goes away and another piece comes in. But that was my other learning, that there is not one model and one frame for developing it, which was, for somebody who does leadership development and wants to sell it, was a little bit irritating, but nevertheless, that was the finding. And out of the ways to develop it, the biggest thing that we need to do is some form of reflection. But it doesn't have to be, there's lots of misnomers around reflection. So yeah, that was the sort of highlights, I think.
That's amazing. And there are so many similarities as you're talking about. First, you've got to define it. Even if you didn't think you're going to have to do that, you have to work it out. What is your definition? So yeah, just like you, I had to do that. And trying to work out how people move towards it. I didn't work that out as part of my research. It was only when I was talking to people about the research, people were saying, well, how can I become more self-aware then? And it was through my book that I started to put things together, and I got a compass, whereas you have a jigsaw puzzle. So that's really interesting. Similarities and differences. We will make sure that there are links to your website and your forthcoming book, and we'll talk about that shortly.
Well, and you should make sure there's links to your compass as well, because, it's horses for courses. That's the other thing I learned about developing self-awareness. What's your personal learning style? What works for you? And what works for me now at this time in my life might not work for me in the future, or might not have worked for me before. So I think the more people have access to how to develop it, the better, really.
Yes, definitely. I will make sure that it's there as part of that sharing. In an article you wrote a few weeks ago, you talked about self-awareness, self-consciousness, and self-knowledge, which you've just mentioned, that this interchangeability. How are they different? How are they the same? And does it matter?
Does it matter? I think from a academic construct clarity perspective, it absolutely matters. And if you were a quantitative researcher and you wanted to develop a measure, you have to have that clarity. So I think, yes, it does matter from an academic perspective. For leaders, and more practically, I think it matters in terms of them getting clear on what self-awareness means for them, and hopefully provide some sort of bookmark, line in the sand for them to think about. So that's why I believe it matters. And like you've just highlighted, we can't develop it if we don't know what it is. So we've got to be clear on what it is first before we even think, are we motivated to develop it, which I'd say is the next thing. So the similarities, it's all terms about self. It all is focused on self and how we're showing up in the world. The differences, and this is how I've differentiated it based on the systematic literature review and research I did in that space, was self-consciousness is the intrapersonal components of self-awareness, the inner bit, i.e.
Okay.
values and beliefs, inner motivations, inner needs, the things that define us. So the intra. Now, some later leaders who wrote around self-consciousness, like some people, two people called Trapman and Campbell, also brought in the interpersonal as well. But I've created real boundaries around that to get construct clarity perspective. So intrapersonal is a part of self-awareness. It makes self-awareness up with some other stuff. Whereas self-knowledge is what I get having done some self-awareness work. And for me, self-knowledge is the knowledge of how I'm showing up, the knowledge of my biases, my prejudice, my drivers, my motivations, and being really honest about them. So for me, self-knowledge is the output of self-awareness. It's the part of doing the work. So that's how I've differentiated it.
That definitely makes sense. So we've talked about your book very briefly. It's going to be available in October 2025, am I right?
Yes, 21st of October is the actual release date. It's on Amazon and Waterstones now.
For pre-order, right? We will make sure that that link is in the show notes. Very exciting. It's called You Are Not as Self-Aware as You Think You Are. So what are readers going to discover in your book? What will be in it that they will want to read about?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I know you did a podcast with Robert Diggins on highly relational. And I remember when he introduced me, he said, "Oh, this is the incredibly self-aware Julia Carden." And I said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa." Because I think the thing I really want to emphasize in my book is the minute we start thinking we're self-aware or we think we've done the work, we're actually not.
Yes.
Because there's always new things. And I really love the quote by Pema Chodron, who's a Buddhist. And she says, we work on ourselves in order to work with others, and we work with others in order to work on ourselves. So if I'm a leader, I've got lots of other people that are going to be telling me something about myself. So it's an ever evolving thing. So I really digest that in the book, but I take people through what self-awareness is. And then I break down each of my components, or I call them ingredients because I love cooking. So take down values and beliefs, take down motivations, and how might you develop that component? And I've done it in a way that if I was the leader and I'd already known I've done lots of work on my values and beliefs, I might dive into how do I develop the physiological awareness that I haven't done. There's also some thinking in there around how you might support others in developing self-awareness. And there's also some thinking about when self-awareness might slip into self-delusion, self-deception, or hubris. And the reason it's called You're Not as Self-Aware as You Think You Are is I once was speaking to a leader who I wasn't working with. I was working with this team. And I was thinking, actually, it's you that probably needs to do the work, not the team. And I said to him, so, as a leader, lonely, who do you use to challenge your thinking, to think things through in a confidential way? And he said, oh, I don't need anybody. I'm very self-aware.
Alarm bells.
You're not, because I've realised I was on a quest to be more self-aware and thought, oh, when I've done the work, I'm done. And I've realised that's not the case. I realised that some time ago because I think it was Lawrence Barrett talks about it being something like an elusive concept that once we think we've got a grasp of it, it slips out of our hands and we have to chase after it
A
again.
will-o'-the-wisp.
Yeah,
Yes.
a will-o'-the-wisp. There we go. Lovely. Love that.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book and seeing particularly how close we are and how different we are in our ideas. In your book, you do talk about how we see ourselves and how others see us. When you're thinking about leaders, how much attention do leaders need to pay to both of those things?
Oh, massive, equal and more. And interestingly, when I was doing my research, somebody said to me, well, self-awareness can be a very narcissistic, overindulgent activity, which is why on my diagram that helps define it, I've put the interpersonal first. So we're doing it in service of others. So I think you can't do one without the other as a leader, because as a leader, we are serving others, however you perceive it, we are leading other people. So we've got to do both. And actually, if we don't do the inner work, the intrapersonal stuff, that's when we're likely to easily slip into conflict, inappropriate behaviors and emotions in the workplace. So being able to do both is really, really important, and spend time developing both. But that's the other reason we're not as self-aware as we think we are, because to get real awareness of our interpersonal, how others experience us, is really hard as a leader. Because if I ask my team, they're going to possibly tell me what I want to hear, because they want to get promoted, they want to keep my favor, they want me to like them. They might be people pleasers themselves. I'm only going to hear what I want to hear, because I'm going to delete, distort, and generalize anything that doesn't quite fit with my perspective. So it's really hard to get accuracy on that, which is the other reason I say you're not as self-aware, because there's always fuzziness and messiness around that.
Yes, definitely. One of the best things that I've done is a feed forward. And I think it comes from Marshall Goldsmith. I think he coined the term, but that feed forward, it's almost like a 360, but probably a little bit more low key than a 360. But it gives you the opportunity to ask those questions of what could I do differently next time? What would you like me to do more of and less of? And it's less of that unpicking what you've done, and quite frankly you can't do anything about it because it's in the past. And I
Yeah.
really like that, and I think it's non-threatening for lots of people. I think people still are reluctant to tell you everything, because how trusting are they that an organization isn't going to out them? But I
Yes.
definitely think that's a really good tool to use, that feed forward.
Yeah, I've said in my book, the two things as a manager to be asking your team is, what do I do? And you can choose the adjective around that. What do I do that you appreciate or value or supports you? And then they've got to ask the second one, what do I do that irritates you, hinders you, gets in the way, demotivates you? So you can pick the adjective, but there's got to be both sides of the coin there. And then
Yeah.
listen to the results, and just accept them, and then go away and think about them, not respond in the moment. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that is a really tough one. And I think you have to know how you respond and how your emotions play out, and be ready for that feedback, and know how you're going to look at it more objectively. What do you need to do to give yourself that space, to give yourself that objectivity? And that's hard.
Yeah, yeah. And I highlight, actually, your reaction to that, your response to that is giving you more data on yourself all
Yes.
the time.
Yes. And I always say to people, give me 48 hours and I can come back to you. But certainly the feedback that I've had from the feed forward exercises are really valuable. And as a team, three of us did it together. And as a team, we really made changes that were very visible and very obvious to our team based on the feedback that they'd given us. And that was really valuable, I think. You say self-awareness is something we never fully reach, and I absolutely agree that that journey, I think, is something that we are always on. How can leaders stay open and curious to that journey? Because you've already mentioned things like, well, actually, I've done the work now, I'm self-aware, tick.
I mean, I think first of all, they've got to see the value in developing self-awareness. I think, and they've got to have some motivation and desire to do it, I suppose, and a degree of acceptance that we're not perfect. So I suspect there are some narcissistic leaders out there that, because they think they're brilliant already, that they don't see the need. So I think, there's got to be some acceptance and desire there, first
Yeah.
of all. And I would encourage them to work with, a thinking partner. That doesn't have to be a coach, but somebody who's going to, hold the mirror up as appropriate and offer them some reflections. And the other simple way to stay open and curious is perhaps just pose themselves a couple of questions. Why did I do that in that meeting today? What led to me to take over or get angry or whatever it is? And I think just hold the question. You don't have to answer the question. It'll be percolating through your system all the time.
Yes. You mentioned writing things down there. What are your thoughts on journaling?
Yeah, I think journaling's great, and it doesn't work for everybody.
Mm.
So I'm very conscious of the fact that journaling in a free fall way, journaling in a way that's unedited, can give us great access to our unconscious. We can get glimpses of our unconscious. But I think if writing's not your thing, it's not going to help. So maybe a mind map, or drawing an image, or, you know, speaking, or doing an audio, or doing a poem is also valid. But some form of reflective activity definitely is supportive.
As you were talking there, I'm thinking coaching feels like the the out loud version of journaling. Does does that make sense? Does that resonate with you?
Yes, it can. And a coach can also offer reflections back on what they're hearing, how you're showing up. A coach can also ask questions to challenge what you're writing and say, is that true? Is that really what happened? You know, if we had that other person in the room, what would they be? So a coach can help you see it from other perspectives. They can use some exercises to do that. So there is an element, if it could be journaling out loud, but you've also got the challenge and the let's look at it from some other perspectives going on as well.
Mm.
Doesn't have to be a coach, a therapist, equally valid in this space.
With the people that you have worked with over the years, so since 2008, you've seen lots of different clients and people who come to coaching. Have you found that that people have got to the point of saying, actually, do you know what? Maybe I'm the one that needs to make the change here. And I ask that on the basis that I've spoken to a few people who are coaches, and we talk about this. What if somebody isn't self-aware when they come to coaching? Where do you start to get them to a point where they can come back to developing self-awareness so that they can move forward again?
I a mix. So I use the analogy like, are they a customer? Are they a customer for coaching? Are they a customer to do some work on themselves? And are they a customer to do that work with me? So
Okay.
sometimes what you find with people coming into the coach space, because their line manager or their organization have sent them, is they're still at the shop window deciding whether they want to come in the shop or not.
Yeah.
They may have got into the shop and be looking at stuff on the rail, but they're certainly not at the counter paying for it. Now, through the development of the relationship and through the coach's capacity to hold their not moving forward or they're tentatively
Mm.
exploring, they may end up at the counter. And I say may because they may not.
Yeah.
And you know, I spoke to somebody today who does want to do some work, but because of their personal situations has not got the capacity to be in that space. And they were really honest about that. So there's something for me as well. And I talk about in my book about doing this work with compassion to yourself. Have you
Mm.
got the capacity to do it right now? Because you may not. And that's fine as well. You know, it has its downsides, but I think there's, you know, have we got the capacity to do it?
I often talk to people who have members of staff who maybe are very challenging, maybe performance is something that's tried to be tackled, but actually they're not getting very far, and people are sent to coaching. How do people respond to that? Are they in a place where they can move forward, or are those the very people who aren't even looking in the shop window yet?
I think it depends. I think
Mm.
what's important to them in their life right now. I think there's no one fixed way on that. And maybe you only nudge the door open with them, and that's still good work.
Mm.
But they may not be ready. And also, you know, those it's really interesting when people come with their team member that can't change, is underperforming, very difficult, challenging, whatever it is. And they always want to change that other person. What are they going to change in themselves?
Yes,
You know that lovely Winnie the Pooh quote about Pooh Bear kept bumping down the stairs, and if only you could stop bumping for a moment and find another way.
indeed. And you can't change others, you can only change yourself.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, I accept that some people are incredibly challenging to manage and lead and probably don't want to be in that organization or in that job or
Mm.
working with that leader. And the leader may have tried everything, but what accountability are they taking for how the relationship is and the unconscious dynamics? You know, a question I often use, and I say, first response, best response. And it's taken from a well-known coaching supervisor, Robin Showett. And he just says, what would happen if you're on a desert island together? Well, you know, if I, the leader, respond and say, well, we've been opposite the ends, we're not talking, well, that's the unconscious dynamic of that relationship, hey?
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good question to ask, isn't it? It really cuts it down. You mentioned the question earlier. How do people start to develop this curiosity? Why am I behaving like this? How can people start to build those kind of things into more of a habit in terms of their leadership practice?
How can you build a habit? It's like anything. I think what I would be interested in is how do people build their own habits and their own, what does it traditionally works for them? Some people like a reminder, don't they, on the fridge door, on their phone. So what helps you build a habit? So I think that's the first thing, getting clear on what works for you in that space. And keep it really simple and light. So just, Marshall Goldsmith talks about a daily questions but triggers, what got you here won't get you there. So maybe just start with a daily question that's light, not going to lead you to take you into some negative, deep place, but it's just light enough to just, oh yeah, how often did I do X today? Or what was the impact? Do you know what I mean? And maybe have a daily question for a week or a month or wherever long is appropriate for you, but start simple, but think about how do you normally build a habit that works. And I know there's been that book, is it Atomic Habits, talks about
Ah,
start building something into your daily thing that you already do, like while you're cleaning your teeth, or if you have a meditation practice, or if you journal every day, or if you go for a dog walk in the morning, what could you insert in your daily practice that you're already doing?
yes. Doing something simple, I think, is a really good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
You describe coaching supervision as a sandpit to play in rather than a courtroom to judge, which I really like. Can you explain what you mean by that? And how does coaching supervision fit as part of being a coach?
Yeah. Let me start with the latter question first. So, coaching supervision is about us as coaches reflecting on our own practice, reflecting on how we're showing up with our clients, where are our habits, where are our trends, where are our default settings, where perhaps are we a bit blind to. So, it's a space to reflect on all of that. That quote, a sandpit in which to play rather than a courtroom in which to judge, is from Robin Showett, who really took supervision from therapy into coaching. He also says a mystery to embrace rather than a problem to solve. And for me in coaching supervision, what I want to work with coaches is how can we hold uncertainty? How can we explore multiple perspectives? How can we perhaps, when we were kids, if we built a sandcastle on the beach and we turned it out, and it was rubbish, we'd just stamp on it and build a new one. But as adults, we're like, oh my God, that sandcastle, I got, it's got to be perfect. And we then can't see other perspectives or other ways of being playful. And so there's something for me about let's be a bit playful and ridiculous. I often say, if you had a really absurd, ridiculous idea, or if you could say anything in the world, what would you say? And often those things are not absurd and they are things that you could use and say to your clients. But we put limits on our rules around how we think we can behave. So that sandpit in which to play is let's build some other sandcastles. And if they've got a bit of a rough edge, well, let's just see what that's all about.
That's interesting. Yes, that different perspective. And you're right, as leaders, we are very much trying to get everything right. And of course, we have moved on from the days of hero leaders, or we're moving on from that time. But I think we still do our best to get things right. And we get very offended when we are told that it's not right. So
Yeah.
learning about that feedback, but having that curiosity to accept that feedback gives you an opportunity to be better.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's something for me there about leaders. If I could embrace that uncertainty, sitting with uncertainty, how many other more options might come available? And I think
Mm,
sometimes as leaders, we get hooked into feeling that we've got to have the answer, we've got to have it now, and we've got to be
yeah,
perfect all of the time. We can't make a mistake. Well, none of that's human, is it?
absolutely.
That's an AI robot.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Your book gives readers practical steps to grow their self-awareness. So before you go, can you share one way with us that will help leaders develop their self-awareness muscle if they want to, if they've never done anything before and they want to start this practice, something to help them kick it off?
Yeah. Start by asking yourself a simple daily question.
Okay.
You don't have to write it down, just have it in your head. Nancy Klein always says we think better in the presence of a question. So start with a question. I also, if you want to then get a bit more serious about it, pick one of those ingredients and then make that a bit of a focus. And I think that's a great starting point, really. Yeah.
Brilliant. Julia, what is next for you and Carden Consulting and your coaching work? And what is next in your sphere of self-awareness and self-aware leadership?
Well, first of all, for my own self-awareness, in fact, I was having a conversation today with somebody. I work with my own coach supervisor, but also been working with a therapist. My therapist and I've been on a journey for 3.5 years. I'm about to change to somebody new. So there'll be some work to do there. So we'll see where that leads to with a much more Jungian perspective. I want to really get some work on unconscious around dreams and symbols and stuff. So that's
Interesting.
my personal thing. Also, personally, for me, my own self-awareness is about trying some new things. I'm told myself, this is my own belief, which is, we'll see whether this holds on, that I'm rubbish at art. So I'm going to try to do some painting. We'll see how that goes. I'm going to go to a paint and sip. So that's my own journey at the moment. And then with regards to Carden Consulting, I have a bit of a wish to take the principles of coaching supervision where we reflect on how we're showing up as a coach into the leadership space and work with small groups of leaders about them reflecting on their leadership practice. So we call coaching a practice, we call therapy a practice, but let's think about leadership as a practice and how can you reflect on that space. So maybe working with groups. I think that's going to be challenging with people from different corporates and companies because of sharing stuff and what have you. But that's a desire I've got, and I'm sort of mulling over how to make that happen. Book writing perspective, no more complete books. I think I'm looking at potentially editing a book with somebody else. I haven't really got all my thinking straight on that yet. I've just co-written another academic paper around continuing personal and professional to bring more of an element on self into our professional development space. So that's what's happening at the moment.
Wow, that sounds really interesting, especially that bringing leaders together to have that opportunity and that space to think about leadership as a practice. I think that is really interesting. So I will make sure that there is a link to both your website and your LinkedIn profile. So if people want to find out more about joining that group or those groups, wherever they may be, that would be something that I think watchers and listeners would be really interested in. And just a supplementary question whilst I'm thinking about it. You've done a PhD, I've done a doctorate, PhD, same thing. When you came to the end of that, did you have this overwhelming desire to find another one and do something else?
No.
Just me.
No, not do another PhD. And I said I was never, ever going to do any more research ever again. But I have just agreed to work with a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Cross, and we're going to be exploring what value do coaches place in coaching supervision and doing some qualitative work there. She's leading the research, she's taken the lead, but I'm going to be her research partner. So having said I was never going to do any research, I also said I was never going to write another academic paper. So I've just ticked that off and now I'm doing a bit of research. No, don't want to do another doctorate. But I think the books filled that void a little bit in giving me the space to sit, think about concepts and write them down. That sort of filled some of the stuff that I quite enjoyed about the PhD, the reading, reflecting on that, then what that meant, and then writing about it. The book has done that. So I'm wondering once the book's out whether I'll notice that void a bit more.
Maybe book two.
Well, I'm not going to say that, I think.
Never say never.
Yeah, never say never. What about
Julia,
you? Are you going to do another doctorate?
probably not a doctorate like you, a similar sense of I need to do something, but who knows what. But I have promised myself that I will do a second book that will focus on the 9 behaviors of the self-aware leadership compass. So that has been percolating for a little while. I had hoped to get it out by 2026, but who knows what the world will allow me to do. But there's a glimmer of a plan. So maybe, we never know.
Co-writing.
Yes. Well, who knows how the world will take it, and yeah, who knows what will happen between now and 2030.
Yeah.
Julia, I'm really pleased that you were able to join me and that we could have this conversation, that both of us have really studied in depth self-awareness, and we're putting it together with leadership and what that means to leadership practice. It's been brilliant having a conversation, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book when it comes out in October. All of the details will be in the show notes for watchers and listeners. But for now, Julia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining me over the last 3 years. I hope you've enjoyed all 100 conversations with thinkers across the globe about self-aware leadership. This is the last episode of the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, but you can keep up to date with my weekly blog by subscribing at ksko.co.uk. A very big thank you to all of the guests that have joined me. Their contribution to the discussion about self-aware leadership has helped to create kinder, more respectful and creative workplaces right around the globe. And of course, a very big thank you to you, listeners and watchers, for tuning in. Looking forward to joining you on your learning journey.